I'm happy to invite our next speaker is Steve Bromley, founder of GameUserResearch.com, and he will give us a speech about confident game development, how to integrate player insights through development process, focus on what really matters. So I'm welcoming you on stage.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
Thank you. Good. And you?
Great, thank you. Really excited to be here today. Thank you for hosting.
Yeah, thank you too. Seems like sound and video is okay. So
Good.
I'm also sharing your presentation. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And
Thank you.
yeah, we can start. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to share with you some thoughts about how we can learn from our players and integrate that into our game development process so that we can make confident decisions whenever we're going through making our games, going through production. We can make sure that players understand this, players enjoy the games we're making, and ultimately lead to more successful games. First of all, a little bit about my background. So I am a games user researcher. What a games user researcher does is they run studies to understand players' behavior, understand players' opinions, and use that to check whether the games that we think we're making are being received by players in the way in which we think they're received. I've been in the games industry for a little bit over a decade. I spent 5 years at PlayStation, and some of the titles I worked on at PlayStation are visible currently. In the last 5 years, I've spent a lot of time helping game teams run studies, helping them both by running user research studies, but also helping them build this capability in-house if they're interested in running their own studies or interested in finding out, do players like my game before it's too late? I've been helping teams build that capability. I also do a lot about education and advocacy. I started the IGDA's mentoring scheme to help people learn how to do careers in games user research. I wrote a book about games user research. I just want to help people understand how to do this and how to integrate it into the games they're making. But before that, we'll talk about why it's important. And I'm going to start with a development disaster. So I'm lucky that I get to work with a number of studios. One that will remain nameless for today was working on a free-to-play battle royale game and had been working on that for many years. Like many games, they didn't put it in front of players particularly early. Instead, testing was treated as a milestone where they were waiting until it's nearly done in soft launch, and then we'll put it in front of players and see what works, rather than getting that true ethos of iterative development. What we saw when we finally got this in front of players was a problem. We saw that players didn't understand their primary objective. They didn't know what a battle royale was or how battle royales work. And because of that, they were just spawning in the game, almost immediately dying, and being confused about what they were meant to be doing, why they'd failed, what was going on here. The players that we'd recruited, who were appropriate players, were attracted by the IP, the intellectual property behind the game, rather than coming because of the genre, and so they didn't know the conventions of the genre. What we're seeing is they repeatedly die within the game and then abandon it altogether. With high acquisition costs, particularly for mobile games, this was a mobile game, that's a disaster. We would spend a lot of money if this was live through advertising and user acquisition to get players to try the game for a first time. They would immediately die as soon as they started the game and then think, well, this is terrible, I don't know what I'm doing or what's going wrong, and we would lose them immediately. Now, because the team had run this study very late, they ran into an issue. Because it is late, they're boxed in about the changes they can make. It's very expensive to make development changes late in development. They have limited options about what they can do with it. And ultimately, this was a significant issue for their development process, causing a lot of rework, causing a lot of costs, and the type of thing we'd like to avoid. Now, it doesn't have to be this way. What I'd like to promote today and what I'd like to talk you through so that you can do this yourself is helping make a game that players understand and players like, so that when you do acquire users, when you are spending on advertising, whether that's on a mobile game, whether that's at traditional advertising for traditional console games, and you're getting new players, you are keeping those players. They're getting through a successful first-time user experience, you're hooking them, and ultimately you're not throwing away acquisition spend. When we, again, talking about mobile specifically, this is particularly important for mobile games. Acquisition costs are so high in this area, and typically less than 10% of players make it to day 5 of playing a new game. Moving the dial just a little bit on how many players get through that first week successfully will be hugely impactful on the success of your game overall. And so today we're going to talk about how to do that. We're going to talk about how to use playtesting and how to use user research throughout development to see some benefits, both for your design vision, you'll make a game that players like, but also that has a real impact on business outcomes. It means you'll increase your retention and the lifetime value of the users that you do have. It means you'll reduce the amount of rework and the production costs of making your games because you'll be throwing away less work. And ultimately, your team will be aligned on what they're making. You'll have a strong understanding of what players will think and what players will do. And you'll be able to make confident decisions throughout development that will anticipate what player behavior will be like. And in this talk, we're going to reference a number of user research methods. We'll talk a little, you might be familiar with some of these, but some that we'll refer to include one-to-one interviews where you're talking with another player, you're asking them some questions live and they're responding to you live. We'll talk about mass playtests where you're getting a lot of people to play the game at once and perhaps relying on quantitative measures taken from those sessions to make sense of a lot of people playing through your game. We'll talk about surveys and what you can get from getting players to self-report their own feedback and their own thoughts about what they've seen and what's happened. We'll talk briefly about analytics and the type of data that you'll get by tracking player behavior within the game through telemetry or analytics. And we'll talk about one-to-one playtests, where you've brought in a single player, you're observing them playing, you're watching what they do in the game, and maybe throwing in some questions from time to time to understand what's going on in their heads. We'll also be talking about this in the context of the game development timeline. Now, in different studios, they have different ways of describing how games are made and the process they go through. A version I quite like is taken from Richard LeMarchand's book, A Playful Production Process, where we'll go through these processes of ideation, pre-production, production, and post-production. And through each, we'll talk about how we can be integrating player insights and how that will help your team make better decisions throughout this process. Which takes us to our first point we'll talk about today, ideation. Now, again, I'm sure most people in the audience are familiar with the idea of ideation. That's typically that first stage of you're making a new game and you don't really know what you're making at this point. As a team, the thing that you and your team are trying to do, and typically it's quite a small team at this stage when you're doing ideation, is discover one or more ideas, think about what could we make and what could be a fun mechanic, or what could we build an experience off? What could the root of this core loop of the game be? And also, in this stage, teams will want to start to describe the experience they think they want to make. They'll start to talk about their assumptions about how players are going to feel, or their ideal feeling that they want to create from players, their assumptions about what players will do when they're playing these games, and just start to describe that vision of what we think a game could be. Now, even though at this point we typically don't have a huge amount of code, you haven't really made anything, perhaps you've made one or two prototypes to try and explore an idea, but there's not a huge amount here of game-ready code, there's still a huge potential to understand your users and get value from your users at this stage. The first activity teams should look at is defining your players. That's finding ways to articulate who do we think will play this game, what do we think their behavior is going to be within the game, and who are our players going to be. The reason why this is valuable is because you and your team are going to have to make predictions about player behavior later on. You're going to have to guess, what do I need to tutorialize? What will players understand from other games already? how long should a game loop be, and how long will a typical play session be? All these things you're going to have to make guesses about to inform the type of design decisions that will come up later in your development process. And you'll do a better job of those design decisions if you've started by thinking about who are our players and created that alignment within your team to describe this is who we think our players are, and we've all got that shared understanding of who are players. So the reason why you want to define your players at this stage is because you're going to have to make confident predictions about player behavior later on to inform your design decisions. And so you want to know who is the people who will be playing your game. Now, as a study, that's not necessarily before that, in order to do that, you need to understand some things about your player. In what I've observed from teams going through this process and the artifacts that teams have made from doing studies to understand their players, is the most valuable things you can understand is players' other experience. What other games are your players likely to play? Why do they decide to play those games? What is it about those games that resonate for them? What do they like about those other games that they play? What do they not like about those other games they play? Will help you build an understanding of who your players are and their typical playing behavior. You should also be understanding at this time, where are players when they play our games? How long is a typical play session? What other constraints do they have on their time? Are they likely, if it's a mobile game, for example, do they play games second screening in front of the TV? Do they play them on a commute? Do they have the sound on or off? That type of data will help you inform your design decisions that you want to make, because you need to know how long will a play session be, how much attention is my player going to give, how often do we need to create opportunities to off-ramp and pause and stop, whether it is a traditional console game, whether it's a PC game, whether it's a mobile game. Understanding how people are playing similar games to yours will be tremendously valuable. And the way to do this isn't so difficult. It's starting with one-to-one interviews with players of games from your competitor set. So find people who play your competitor games and just have even somewhat informal discussions with them about what other games are you playing, why do you play those games, how did you discover that game, what led you to play that game rather than another game in the series. Those kind of discussions can start to reveal a lot of information about who is playing your game and why they're playing. And through that exploration of what they're playing, why they play, and where they're playing games, you'll start to build up your own understanding of your players and ability to anticipate their future behavior. As a quick tip about this, you know you're done with this when you and your team know enough about how and where your players are going to play games that you can start to make confident predictions about their behavior when you're making creative decisions. And you can run this as a standalone test, but also you can build on that understanding over time. If whenever you're running other play tests, you take a few minutes just to chat about what other games they're playing alongside the prototype that you're presenting or the game that you're testing with them, it will build up that shared understanding over time. A second thing you can do during ideation is also understand your competition. You don't have to start your game from scratch, especially because players won't be playing your game in isolation. They'll also be aware of the competition. And so by looking at how players are experiencing competitor games, it will help you understand what's working and what's not working and what the minimum expectations of the game are, so that you can build from that understanding yourself. Again, by that understanding, you can achieve this through that discussion with users about what games they're playing and why they're playing them and where they're playing those games. You could also put them in front of other games. You can both review critical and user feedback of competitor games by going onto app stores or going onto Steam reviews and look what people are saying about those games. But you can also run your own studies on competitor games, and that's something that I've done with some of the teams I've worked with, where we've put players in front of competitor games and drawn our own conclusions about what's working and what's not working, and what are the core pillars that we can integrate into our own game by playtesting competitor games. There's also a benefit if you're looking at competitor games and have done this work of defining your competitor set, that you can start to anticipate your own sales data based on the perception of other games and where you could sit compared to that. I've written an article called Discover If Players Will Buy Your Game that helps explain a bit about this. And on my website, gamesuserresearch.com, that's mentioned under the slides there, if you find the article Discover If Players Will Buy Your Game, it talks about an approach of how you can draw your own sales estimate based on how competitor games are doing. So to sum up ideation, you and your team will have spent this period coming up with ideas about what your game could be, coming up with prototypes, and starting to build that understanding of your players. To know whether you're ready to move on and whether you understand enough about your players to leave ideation, you hopefully have achieved some ideas that you feel good about, and you've tested some things to see if, found something fun that you think could be a game. But from a player insight angle, you also want to make sure that you and your whole team understand your players well enough that you can start to predict their behavior when you start putting real code down, which is what we'll talk about next. So that next development phase is pre-production. And again, the terms will differ in the different studios and the approaches differ in different studios, but it's likely that your goals are probably going to include building out those best ideas. So going from that raw prototype or that raw idea to building something that represents a fuller implementation of that idea, a vertical slice or something that is a core loop for the game. And also during pre-production, you and your team are probably thinking about actually what will production look like. When you hit production, your team size is going to ramp up. You're going to have a whole bunch more people making your game. And by looking at the length it takes you to make a vertical slice or a representative sample of your game, you can start to anticipate actually what will production look like for our team. Now, when it comes to player insight during pre-production, there's a couple of really useful things that you and your team could be doing. The first of all is making sure that you're validating the core game loop. You know that when you actually hit production, it's going to be much more expensive to make changes because you're committed on what you're going to make and you've started throwing out levels and puzzles and creating content. It becomes significantly harder to make changes in production. So one of your goals in pre-production is to make sure that you're confident if we just built more of this game that we've made in pre-production, will it work? And that's some of that data you can get from players. You can start to understand, do players enjoy this thing we've made? What's working well with it? What's particularly good and we should emphasize in the final product? What things are not working currently and we need to iterate further to make sure that players understand and like this? And again, that's a thing that you can achieve through studies. One-to-one moderated playtests where you bring in someone who represents your target player, you're putting them in front of the game, you're watching them go through the game and you're seeing what are they enjoying, what are they not enjoying, you're asking qualitative questions about that experience as they play. We'll start to build up that understanding about what is the state of our core loop, is this fun, are people enjoying this, and is it safe for us to build a full game's worth of experience based on this core loop. Again, that type of small-scale qualitative feedback is where you get the real detail and the real depth from this. But you might want to build on that, particularly if it's a risky proposition that you're exploring, to see how representative the feedback you're getting from your qualitative sessions are. And that's when you might look to mass play test, that idea of getting lots of people to play through the core loop. We might use surveys to ask some questions and start to scale the qualitative feedback we've heard, but building up that combined qualitative and quantitative understanding of your users at this point will mean you're confident when you're in production that you are building something that players will like when you go further. Now, one tip or one thing to be aware of when you're doing this is a lot of what you're trying to get from this stage is going to be opinion data, players saying what they like or what they don't like. And that's opinions are somewhat subjective, or they're extremely subjective and can be tricky to handle because unlike usability issues, for example, where it's objectively there's a problem and we need to act on it, a lot of opinion feedback needs to go through a further interpretation from you and your design team about players. Is what players are telling us actually the experience we want to make, and so that's okay, or do we need to make changes? I guess a small example from that is if you play tested a Soulsborne game like Dark Souls, what you'll get back is players saying this is very hard, and maybe that's okay. You need to make sure that you and your design team aren't giving up authority about things like what is the experience to players, and instead are hearing that it's hard and having that internal discussion about, actually, do we want it to be hard? Maybe that's okay, and that's the experience we want, to create a hard experience, rather than just acting on what players tell us. So something that you can do with this type of opinion data is make sure that you're interpreting it internally, rather than just acting on what players are telling you without processing that. You'll know you're ready to move on from pre-production when you're confident that if we built a full game's worth of this vertical slice, players will like this. We'll know that it's fun, and you can build a full experience worth of this confidently knowing that players will like it. Also, you should hopefully leave pre-production with knowing what you're going to build when you reach production. Through that exploration of the vertical slice, you'll be able to anticipate how long will production take, what are the priorities from a player's perspective. So what are the best bits that we want to emphasize during production, and what are the bits that aren't working and perhaps you want to remove or deprioritize in production. And you'll be able to make confident prioritization decisions as you go through production. You'll know you're ready to go. Which moves us on to production. Now, coming back to the team goals, what you and your team are probably trying to achieve in production is, at first step, building the game. You would like to leave this with having something that is a reasonable representation of the game by the time you get to the end of it. Also, at this point, managing scope creep and avoiding rework is very important. We've talked about how costly changes get in production as team sizes ramp up and as it gets increasingly difficult to make changes because you've built interdependent systems. It means that changes do become very difficult, and we want to avoid that. Again, player insight can be very helpful here, starting with the idea of doing usability studies, depth usability studies. In production, you'll be making a lot of content. You'll be making new puzzles, you'll be making new levels, you'll be making tutorials, and each of these you want to be very confident that players understand it and they're able to get through it, so that you're not creating difficulty spikes or pain points. What you want to understand from players at this stage is, do players enjoy doing this section of gameplay or this thing we're asking them to do? Do players understand it? Do they know what they're meant to do? Are they able to get through it? Is it creating the emotional reaction we expected? If you want your game to be hard, are players saying this is hard when they get through it? If you want your game to be exciting, are they excited by it? These type of emotional reactions, we want to check now whether we're getting them. Ultimately wrapping up to the idea of, does this work? Is the experience we're making the one we hope to make? As a study, I would be looking at iterative one-to-one moderated playtests. We already talked a little bit about that idea of doing one-to-one playtests where you bring in people, you put them in front of the game, you see what they understand and what works and what resonates. You can be doing this as an iterative process, by which I mean we'll bring in a few players, we'll put them through it and we'll see where their problems are. Then the team will attempt to fix any problems that emerged, make the tutorials clearer, make the puzzle clearer, address those usability issues, and then retest after to see if it's been fixed and reveal other potential issues that occur. What I see with these type of studies when teams run them is you get a huge amount more value just from watching even 4 or 5 people play your game regularly than doing a giant study with hundreds of participants and lots of survey responses. And so making sure you're creating that regular cadence of playtests of running studies every couple of weeks or every month will make it possible to make changes quickly and early, check those changes have worked, and ultimately leave production with confidence that you have a game that players understand. A second study to think about while you're running through production is just having regular pulse checks as well. That's putting your game in front of a broader section of players, looking out for pain points. What's working, what's not working, overall, how is the experience that we're making coming together? Because that will help focus your development. It'll help you build your confidence that you're working on the most important things and prioritizing and putting your attention on the most important things and addressing the biggest pain points. And the risk of not doing this is you end up putting a lot of attention and time on features or mechanics that later on you cut entirely because you realize actually this wasn't a priority for players and we didn't get it done in time. Whereas doing regular prioritization sessions like this will help. What this looks like is a study to discover, are players enjoying the overall experience? Does it all come together as a cohesive whole? What aspects are they finding frustrating? Where are they getting stuck? And ultimately building that understanding of the state of the game. And that can be done with regular mass playtests of external players, making sure you're regularly inviting groups of people in to play the game who represent new players, as in external players, not your internal team, and putting them in front of the game and using quantitative measures such as surveys or analytics to capture where the problems are and what bits are landing well with players. There's also value of doing this internally, so taking the time as a studio to regularly sit down and make sure that everyone in the studio is playing the game as well. That not only might flag some issues, even though there are some differences between your team and external players, you'll still learn some issues, but also it helps build an aligned internal vision where you and your team all have that shared understanding of what is the state of the game, helping make sure that you are all on the same page and working in the same direction. Now, a small tip about this one, if you are doing this where you're bringing lots of players, you're getting them to fill out surveys, you're going to end up with quite a lot of unstructured data, people's feelings, people's emotions, issues, which can be slow to analyze and iterate. By creating surveys, creating forms or other templates that encourage structured feedback, rather than just, we've got a Discord channel where people can chuck in their feedback, or everyone will just add it to Slack, that will help optimize your analysis time and make sure that it's not a huge burden to regularly run these type of internal or external playtests. So we've talked about some of the player insight opportunities for production. You'll know you're ready to move on from production when you're confident you understand the following things. Do players understand how to use each of your systems in your game? So are those usability issues addressed and can they get through it? And also through the pulse checks, when your game is a complete experience, does it come together as a whole and do players like the combination of all these systems adding together into making one complete game? Is this resonating correctly? Now, the last section I wanted to talk about is tests that you can run during post-production and launch. And some of the things that you and your team will be looking at in this stage anyway is balance, making sure the pacing and the difficulty goes through an appropriate balance and players are hitting a flow state. Identifying and removing bugs is obviously very important during this post-production and launch phase. And also just working out what's important for the future. What is the right content that after we've launched, if we're going to add DLC or if it's a live service thing where we're going to continue to add content, where is that effort best placed? Now, our attention at this stage through a research study can be to run studies to balance that difficulty and pace for players. We want to find and look out for difficulty spikes or pacing issues that are going to cause players to quit and ultimately cause issues for your retention, as we talked about earlier. The type of thing we want to discover is, are there any sections that are more difficult or more easy than we expected? And how do players experience this game over time? Are there points where their interest or motivation dips? And if so, why does it dip at those points? Now, these are solid quantitative questions. And so this is when you start to need to have a lot of players come through your game. Those type of mass playtests can either be done in a lab-based context where you're inviting lots of people to come and play a thing in person, or through soft launches or through open betas, but ways of getting a lot of people into your game. And then you can use analytics or surveys to pinpoint where are these problems and what is the where are there sections that are harder than expected or easier than expected? Where are there sections where players drop off? Is a type of quantitative question. My tip for this would be, as well as taking these quantitative measures, if you can also find a way to get qualitative perceptions from players about why they're quitting or why they're leaving, which there are a number of ways you can do. You can also combine this with some sort of one-to-one studies as well to explain what you're seeing from your quantitative studies. You can ask players some qualitative questions in surveys to ask them to explain why sections were hard or why they stopped playing. But combining that qualitative and quantitative data can be very powerful at this time. Also in this post-production and launch phase, this is the best time to optimize retention. For many games, especially if you're a live service game or a free-to-play game, launch is only the beginning. A lot of these business models require players to stay engaged, not just through playing the game for the first time, but for many months after, in order to make enough money from them to justify the acquisition costs. This also can be, you can use player insight and research studies to help answer this. Retention studies can help identify what are those bits that people abandon games so that you can fix them and reduce churn. And you might want to run studies to look at how is that first time user experience over a period of time? What issues are players encountering in their first day of play, first week of play, first month of play, both for this game and also for competitor games. As a research method, you can look at diary studies for this. So getting players to regularly give feedback throughout every time they play the game or every time they have a play session, looking out for where there are dips in their engagement or where they are giving up on the game. But a longitudinal study, a diary study, is the way to do this, combined with an understanding of player analytics. I appreciate I've been very brief about explaining how to do that. We can talk more about it in the question and answers after, but this type of diary study is very common at this stage. Now, a tip with diary studies where you're getting players to give regular feedback on your game over a period of time is that it does require long-term commitment from players. And it's very common for players to give up on that type of study or abandon it, or you not to get what you're hoping to get from it. Recruiting more players than you think you need, over recruiting for these studies, and also trying to get one last interview out of people when they do give up to say, hey, can you give us another 5 minutes just to say why you gave up on the game, will help you get really valuable data from these sessions. So to sum up post-production and that launch period, those periods aren't really ever done, but for confidence in these stages, I'd be looking to make sure that you have created an experience for players that is consistent, free from difficulty spikes, and your retention is meeting best-in-class metrics. And that's when you know you probably have done enough of player insights when you've hit both these points that you're confident that you have the best possible version of your game you possibly can. Now, I know I've said a lot at this stage about these type of studies and how you can run it. I've created a graphic here that I hope sums up a lot of what I've talked about so far, both what teams are trying to do in each stage of development, and also how research can support with that. What type of studies should you be looking at running in each of these stages so that you are confident that players are going to like your game and you're identifying issues as early as possible, making them as cheap as possible to fix. I'll share a link to where you can get a longer version of this graphic at the end of this talk as well, if it's helpful to you. Now, I spend a lot of time with teams. I've run a lot of playtests in my time, and also helped a lot of teams through this process. The idea of running playtests and user research. And I thought what I'd end with today is, why does it go wrong for teams? And it frequently does go wrong for teams. Usually a starting discussion with teams might include them saying, well, we ran some playtests, but actually they weren't that useful. They only told us stuff we already knew. They didn't reveal new or helpful information. They didn't help us prioritize. Essentially, they became low impact activities. And so teams deprioritize it because it doesn't have a good return on investment. They feel like they're not getting good enough value from their play tests and from their user research sessions that it's worth doing. And so they eventually just stop because, hey, game development is busy, people have other priorities, and we can't justify doing low return on investment activities. Now, after talking to many teams through this process, I started to notice some patterns from teams who were not getting value from their playtests. And so I thought I'd end with covering some of the lessons that I got from those conversations to make sure that when you are running these type of studies that we've talked about so far, you're getting the most you possibly can from those sessions. The first issue that teams run into is they're using the wrong players. So when I ask teams, where are you getting the players from for your user research or for your play tests, they might often say that it's based on whoever's convenient. We might ask people internal to our studio just because they're around. We might ask our friends and families because they'll give up their time and they're cheap. You might, if you're lucky enough to have an existing community like a Discord community, you might be using your existing community for playtests, and which isn't terrible, it's not the worst thing, but over-indexing on that will cause a problem. The problem being all these people aren't like your typical players. Your internal staff already know a lot about the game, and so they can't really represent what a real external user would know and understand because they don't have that same new user experience. Your friends and family probably don't play the right kind of games and aren't really your target player, especially if you've done that work to define your player early on. And so they will give feedback and they will describe problems or thoughts or opinions, but those thoughts or opinions don't represent your typical player, and again can be misleading if you over-index on that. And if you are using your community, again, there are some things you can use your community for, but your community are typically much more hardcore than a typical player. They're much more invested. They care a lot more than a normal player. And so I've seen teams, for example, balance the difficulty of their game so it's too hard because they're balancing for their community who are super engaged and care a lot, and not balancing for actually what is a typical player's experience. And so there can be some missteps if you're focusing on your community. What's gone wrong with these teams who are using the wrong players is they haven't done that step of defining their players up front, working out who they think will be playing their game, and then making sure that those are the people who they're inviting to play tests, making sure that those players are the ones whose feedback they listen to, and instead they're listening to people who don't represent their target players, ultimately creating data that doesn't represent their real players and ultimately being a low return on investment activity. The second way I see teams go wrong when they're running these type of studies is often their goals are vague. They're not clear what they want to learn from a playtest or from a user research study. Now, I've given some inspiration in this talk about the types of things that you might want to learn at each stage, but really playtesting and user research is a tool to answer questions that your development team have. Now, if you're not actually spending time with your design team and your production team and your wider development team to work out actually what do we need to know from players, what are we not confident about, what information will help us continue, and what do we need to know to move on, the types of things you're going to learn from your playtests are going to be entirely separate from actually what your team need to know to progress. An ethos I like to talk about is the idea that research is a team sport. The reason we're doing this is to raise the understanding and raise the knowledge of our whole team. And so together we need to be making sure we're defining what do we want to learn from our playtests and using that to inspire the type of method we use, the type of data we go and collect, rather than doing those as two separate activities. A way you can do that is having regular sessions to work out what are the biggest risks, what are our biggest unknowns, with leads from every discipline involved, and then prioritizing those to make sure that you are targeting your playtests and your user research at what is actually important for our teams. The third reason why I see teams go wrong with their playtests and their user research is when they leave it too late. It's very easy to deprioritize playtests and user research, just because we all know game development is a hectic environment. It's often very busy and everything's always on fire at all times. And because of that, it's easy to say, yeah, we will playtest later. We'll do it when we've got a build together at the end of the milestone, rather than doing it as a regular iterative activity. The challenge here is you're storing up learning bad things and boxing yourself in. You will eventually learn all those problems that playtesting will reveal, but you're leaving it until later to learn it. And if you leave it too late, you're not going to be in a position to act on it. It becomes more expensive to make changes later in development. You have to throw away more work because you would have built assets and content that support something you're not going to do anymore. Ultimately, you're creating more expense by learning things too late. So although it can be hard to prioritize user research and playtesting, the spirit that I would like teams to recognize is doing small playtests regularly rather than doing one giant playtest at the end of a milestone will help making running them both more feasible. It's easy to run small playtests rather than one big one, especially if you can be somewhat informal in how you approach it. But also make sure that the findings come at the right time so you can act on them. Doing little and often is the way to get the most value from these type of studies. And again, if you and your studio are wondering how to do this or how to unlock it for your team, I can help with that. So to sum up some of the things we've talked about, what I wanted to cover today was how do we get confident game development? How do we anticipate when we release this, players are going to like it, players are going to understand it. Ultimately, we've made the best possible version of the game we're trying to make. I believe that using your players in the ways we've talked about through running studies throughout development will help you make a game that's understandable, it's enjoyable, and that's good from a game design perspective. Hey, we want our games to be understandable and enjoyable, but also it's very helpful for business people soon and the business of games. As you know, games is that messy creativity of art and business, and we get in trouble if we over-index on we're trying to make a good game without thinking about what is the impact on, is this going to be a successful game? Can it be sold? Will there be a market for this? And the process I've described achieves both of that. It helps you make sure that you are making an artistic game that players understand and enjoy, that meets your design vision, but also it does lower production costs and lower the costs of making a game while increasing the chance of it being successful. You have unlocked better retention, better lifetime value from your players. You have reduced rework during production because you've come to the right conclusion earlier. And ultimately, by having that aligned and confident team, you're going to throw away less work. You're going to be able to make the right thing the first time, and you'll have a less chaotic production environment. If you're interested in exploring more of this, I write a lot about how to do it and approaches for this on my website, gamesuserresearch.com. If you sign up, there's a free book on there called Playtest Plus, which talks about in a bit more detail how to run some of the studies we talked about today, some tips for what to look out for, and ultimately how to make the most of any playtest you're running. And if you are ever running into any issues, this is the type of thing that I help teams with. I can both run these studies, but I also coach teams through the process so that you can build that in-house capability yourself and run better studies in-house. If I can ever help, do get in touch. My email address is there, or you'll find me on the gamesuserresearch.com website. But for today, thank you so much for your time and to cover this topic with you. As I've mentioned at the beginning, I'm very enthusiastic about talking about user research, and I wish you the best of luck for the games that you're making in the future. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, if there are any.
Yeah, thank you so much for the speech. We really have time for questions. I see in the chat some thank you for the speeches from our audience. And first question from Yuri would be, what technologies do you recommend for beginner developers who do a playtest with the friends?
Nice.
How to get most out of the couple of friends?
I think that's a good question. And actually, I think those type of studies you can start with this from a super lo-fi approach. It doesn't have to be expensive to run the first couple of play tests. If you're remote, so you're not physically in the room with them, the couple of things you want to achieve are they can play the games. You need to get the builds to them. You need ideally to be able to record what's happening on the screen, and especially if you want to do this live, I recommend when you're running tests with friends, doing it live, a way that you can jump in and ask questions. Actually, a lot of that can be done with meeting software. If you send them the build to play and then jump on a Google Meet or Zoom and get them to share their screen on it, you can ask questions live. Google Meet and Zoom both allow you to record things, so you can record the whole session so you can go back later and look at it in more detail. But also that costs nothing. Zoom and Google Meet are free for limited use for this. And so you can do a lot with that kind of free software for remote testing. For in-person testing, if you're bringing them to you, again, this doesn't have to be expensive. A setup I really like is you might come across OBS, Open Broadcast Software, OBS. It's some recording software that takes in a variety of inputs and saves it into a final video. Again, you can use OBS for free and you can screen record on it. So that's a way you can capture what they do in the game. You can add a picture-in-picture of a webcam if you have a webcam. So, and also either the webcam's audio or a microphone audio so that you can get the chat in the room. You can hear when you ask them a question and what they say or what they say out loud as they play. And again, all of that is usually free, or if you don't already have a webcam, it's the cost of a webcam. On my website, gamesuserresearch.com, on the article section, I recently wrote a little article about how to get good captures from games. So do look in the article section on gamesuserresearch.com because it talks about the full tech setup for that type of thing. But that's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. We also have one more question. It's how to understand that perfect amount of players that you need for the playtest.
Great question again. The long answer is it depends on what you want to learn. We talked about, in fact, let me go back a few slides to reference the slides. Some of the studies I talked, no, in fact, let's go all the way back to the beginning. That'll be easiest. Sorry about this, won't be a second. So a lot of the process we've talked about is you get a lot of value from this type of one-to-one playtest and one-to-one interviews. Now, a common saying with one-to-one playtests is after about 5 or 6 players, especially if you're interested in usability issues where they're confused or don't know what they're meant to do, you can usually stop after just 5 or 6 players. So show 5 or 6 players your game, look at all the bits where people get confused and stuck, and then you're reasonably confident you've seen a lot of the biggest issues just from those 5 or 6 players. That means that instead of testing more players after that, you should try and fix those problems you've learned so far and then retest later rather than just finding those same problems again and again by doing more users. So for that kind of usability testing we talked about, I'd recommend 5 or 6 players. If you're interested in players' opinions, what they think about the game and the range of opinions out there, you might need slightly more. You might need 10, if you're doing these kind of interviews, you might need 10 to 15 players per type of user. So one-to-one playtests, 5 or 6 users, one-to-one interviews, 10 to 15 users. Some of these, like the surveys and the analytics, are quantitative data where you're doing measuring. You want players to rate how hard the level is, and you're going to compare the ratings from one level to another level. It's a solid quantitative question. That is when you do start to need more players. maybe a typical approach in game development would be looking at 50 to 100 people before you start thinking about quantitative measures, although depending on your exact question, you might want many more. Again, how to sum this up? It depends on what you want to know. You can start from 5 to 6 to learn usability issues. It might go up to hundreds if you're doing measurements from analytics and surveys. There is, again, a guide on gamesuserresearch.com. One of the articles there is how many players do I need for a playtest. There'll be a bit more detail there. Yes.
Cool. Cool. And we have more questions, like what would you suggest for testing online-based games, especially if we are on a low budget and can't afford any external server, cloud?
That's a good point. So with online games, I guess a lot of the things we talked about are still going to be somewhat true. You're still probably going to go through this type of process, and you're still going to want to learn the same types of things that we discussed before at each of these stages. So making sure your idea is fun early in ideation, making sure you've got a full game in pre-production, like got a core loop in pre-production. So the fact it's online doesn't make a huge difference from what you want to learn. Where it does make a difference, or one of the challenges you'll have if you do have lower budget, is actually the finding playtesters can be challenging. A big studio, a big publisher will usually pay people to take part in studies, but because that's easy, it makes recruitment easier because it's worth the investment. But studios with a minimal budget can find it challenging to actually pay people to take part in studies. My recommendations for that, of cheaper ways of finding participants, usually involves first thinking about where can I find the right type of players. After you've done that work to define who your players are, look for existing communities where those people hang out. Are there Reddits where people who play competitive games hang out? Are there Discords from competitive games where these people are hanging out and talking about competitive games? Looking on the Steam forums might be an idea. So first of all, finding where you can find potential playtesters. And then once you've found them, what can I offer them to convince them to take part in my playtest? Obviously, for teams with low budget, it can be difficult to offer money, but you might have other things of value you can offer instead. Either recognition, such as credit in-game currency, if your game is in a stage where it could support in-game currency and that has value. If you have some other teams in it that you know and you're friendly with other game makers, you can offer codes for each other's games as an incentive to take part in playtests. But again, thinking of creative things we can offer people instead of money to take part in playtests is probably going to be the biggest expense that you hit when you're thinking about running your studies, and then one of the biggest challenges. But yeah, I think that's my answer there.
Cool, thank you so much. Yeah, and maybe the last question would be from me. Maybe have you seen maybe somewhere in your career when playtest, like data gathered from the playtest were used for finding investments, for example, or in you consider playtest like more on a stage of development to gather the information which is needed for developers in development stage? Yeah.
I think that's a really good question, actually, and as you've seen, not one I've talked about today. I think there is a big crossover. So although my focus today has been on actually informing the game design, there are a couple of bits that jump out as very valuable for informing if you're looking for investment or making a pitch to a publisher to do these type of activities. The two that jump out to me is, we talked about very early on defining who your players are by looking at their competitor games and what else are they playing. That can very easily lead into market sizing information. So you can look at both when you found your competitor games and what your other games your players are playing. You can then work out how many players exist for these games, what is the average revenue for games in this area by doing the process of you might have come across the idea of, I think it's called the box lighter number. You can look at the number of reviews from competitor games and from that anticipate their revenue. And that's very valuable information for a funding bid, because you can say how much your game will make when it's launched. And funders will definitely be doing this themselves. So you want to get in front of that and have done that yourself. The other bit where it can be very valuable is, I know many publishers these days won't fund ideation or pre-production. They want you to have a vertical slice together, something that represents the game before they'll even consider funding it. If you can play test before that point, so that when you're taking your vertical slice to them, you also have some information saying players like this, they rate it better than other games in the genre. A typical play session is this long, and we estimate that we'll retain players for this many days after playing. That can build confidence in your pitch, because you're helping the publisher, the funder, understand that actually this is going to be a successful game, and it's a sensible investment to make, because you have done some work to validate that your game is good beforehand. So yeah, I think that's a great question, and one I hadn't thought about, but there's a huge crossover there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the answer and for such interesting speech. Yeah, we really welcome you on Games Gathering, and hope maybe sometime in the future to have you offline also.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'd love that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the speech, and have a good day.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope the rest of the conference goes well. I look forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.